Reza Aslan, welcome.
Thank you.
You're an Iranian-American writer, scholar of religions at the University of California, and you're very involved in today's religious and political issues in the US. Today, Western world perceive Islam as a homogeneous group, a unified group, and you proved in your several books that this is really not the case. Can you tell us about the diversity in Islam today?
1 out of every 4 people on earth is a Muslim. So anyone who thinks that those 1.5, 1.6 billion people all think the same way and believe the same way and act the same way are kind of stupid. I mean, it's an idiotic thing to assume. No one assumes that, all Christians believe the same thing or that all Hindus believe the same thing. And yet, you're right, there is this perception that, Muslims all have the same ideas and values, when in reality, Islam is by far the most eclectic, most diverse religion in the world. If you think about it, 1.6 billion people, but without a center. This is very important to understand. The second largest religion in the world is Roman Catholicism, but the difference is that Roman Catholics, all billion of them around the world, all speak with one voice. I'm not saying that they don't have different views and different opinions. Of course they do. But there's one man who's in charge of all billion of those Roman Catholics. That allows for an enormous amount of unity and cohesiveness in the Catholic Church. Now imagine 1.6 billion people, but without a pope, without a Vatican, without any single authority who gets to define who is a Muslim, who's not a Muslim, what is proper Muslim behavior, what is not proper Muslim behavior. What you have is a cacophony of voices, thousands of different experiences and expressions of Islam.
In the same way, a lot of people see the war as a war between the Western world and the Arab world. But you explained that this war within the Arab world is more a war between moderates and extremists.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to expand that and understand that what we're talking about is not just the Arab world. In fact, Arabs make up some 12, 13% of the world's Muslims. I know that most of our focus in the West, especially in Europe and North America, is on this one region. And of course it is, because we have a lot of interests in this region. But Arabs are not the Muslim world. Of the top 5 most populous Muslim countries in the world, only one of them, Egypt, is an Arab country. The future of Islam is not in the Middle East. The future of Islam is in Indonesia, it's in Malaysia, it's in Turkey, it's in Senegal. That said, to the larger point about this clash of civilizations, between the West and Islam, I think that that's just a completely false premise. Yes, it's true that what we're seeing over the last 100 years, not just over the last 10 years, but over the last century, we've been seeing a real conflict taking place within Islam itself, a conflict over authority, a conflict over who gets to define Islam, whether it's the various institutions and the ulama and the imams, or whether it's individuals themselves who get to do so. And that conflict, as it has in all great religions, has led to enormous strife, war, bloodshed. I mean, this is what happens when global religions have these Reformation periods. Now, it is true that because we have so many vested interests in the Middle East, that the Western world, especially Europe and North America, has been dragged into this conflict, and deliberately so dragged into this conflict. And so it may seem from the outside that this is actually a war between the West and Islam, but we have to understand that we're complicit, but we are bystanders in this conflict. We have slipped into this conflict because of the disastrous role that we have played in the region, both in the colonial era and the post-colonial era. We treat most of the Middle East as though it's our personal gas station. But this is a problem that is theirs, and is going to be solved without us.
There is a strong feeling today in the US, but also in Europe, that Islam isn't compatible with modernity. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, the way that I would respond to it is by opening my eyes and looking around me. I mean, a third of the world's Muslims live in free democracies. The largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, is a democracy. The second largest Muslim country in the world, Turkey, is a democracy. The third largest Muslim country in the world, Pakistan, is a democracy. Senegal is a democracy. Bangladesh is a democracy. Egypt is a democracy. I mean, the fact of the matter is that just empirical evidence is enough to ward off this kind of commentary. But let's be clear. When people say that, they're not making an argument. They're expressing a bias. What they mean to say is that Islam is different, that there is something unusual, something extraordinary, something special about Islam, that the multiple factors that have affected every religion in the world, cultural factors, linguistic, literary, social factors that have changed religions throughout centuries, don't work with Islam. That Islam is the same everywhere it goes. Again, one does not need to debate that view. Just simply saying it is enough to understand how ridiculous and illogical the point is.
Recently, there were some issues regarding the media and freedom of speech. There is a huge gap between freedom of religion, respect of beliefs, and freedom of speech. What is the good compromise or balance?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there is a compromise. I mean, it depends on where you are. I mean, let's be perfectly honest here. This is not about just freedom of speech versus freedom of faith. The fact of the matter is that if you're in Germany, you don't have the freedom to espouse Nazi propaganda. And in fact, YouTube is blocked in Germany from showing any kind of Nazi propaganda. If you're in Turkey, you're not allowed to espouse anti-Ataturk sentiments. And in fact, YouTube in Turkey is forbidden by law to show any kind of videos denigrating Ataturk. And yet, we say Germany is a democracy, Turkey is a democracy. So if Egypt wants to forbid, YouTube from showing videos that denigrate the Prophet Muhammad, it's ridiculous for people to say, well, therefore it's not a democracy. You have to say that for Germany and for Turkey as well. I think we have to recognize that democracy is not a singular thing, that it's going to be experienced differently throughout the world. I'm an American. I therefore refuse and reject any kind of limits on the freedom of speech. I'm an absolutist when it comes to my belief that you can say whatever you want, whenever you want, and however you want to say it. I don't have a problem with that. But that's because I'm American, and that's how I was raised, that's the context in which I live. I think that these discussions are important to have. If you start saying that there are certain things that you cannot talk about, well, who gets to define those things? Who gets to define what is denigrating to a religion? These are impossible questions to be answered, and so I think the best thing to do is to not answer them.
What are American Muslims' challenges, especially after 9/11?
It's interesting. The American Muslim community is in this weird paradox right now. On the one hand, it's incredibly wealthy. It has the highest levels of wealth of any immigrant community in the United States. It has the highest levels of education and literacy of any immigrant community. It even has the highest citizenship rates of any community. Very small numbers, 3.5 million, about 1%. Of the population, but rich, integrated, assimilated into every level of American society. And yet, over the last few years, since 2005, 2006, not as a result of 9/11, on the contrary, I think it's a misperception to think that 9/11 made life difficult for Muslims in America. It did not. 9/11 made life difficult for Muslims in Europe. And as a deliberate result of importing Europe's great Islamophobes, the Geert Wilders and the British National Party and the ultra-right parties in places like France and in Italy, by adopting the strategy and the methodology of Europe's very successful Islamophobia industry, the United States over the last few years has managed to create the same sense of fear, the same sense of anxiety about America's Muslim population that so many Europeans feel about their Muslim populations. And so, for instance, in the United States, you hear over and over again in the political mainstream about the Muslim takeover of America, that any minute now, the 1% of the population of the United States that's Muslim is on the verge of taking over the entire country. It's ridiculous. It's laughable. And yet, in a time of economic crisis, in a time of political instability, in a time in which many Americans are facing a real economic and identity crisis, it's a message that works. Fear sells. Fear gets you votes. And so what we're seeing, this sort of surge of Islamophobia in the United States, it's a very new yet successful phenomenon.
So is it possible to change people's mind on this anti-Muslim feeling?
Yes, it is possible to change people's minds, but not through the way that a lot of people think. There is this tendency to think that education or information can change people's minds, that if people just learned more about Islam, then they wouldn't be so afraid of Muslims. That's ridiculous. Education doesn't change perceptions. Bigotry is not something that resides in the mind. Bigotry resides in the heart. Bigotry is about fear, not about ignorance. And the only way that you can battle fear is through relationships. Polls show that if you just know one Muslim, that it cuts in half your negativity rating of Islam. Because if you know a person, if you actually know an individual, then you can't see him as just a symbol.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aslan.
My pleasure.